Well, good afternoon from London. Good morning, America. Good evening, Asia. Hello, whichever time zone you're in. We have a lot of people dialing in today, and for very good reason. Welcome to this IISS webinar on Russia's constitutional vote. First in a series of webinars that we'll be hosting on Russia and post-Soviet issues. We have an outstanding panel to discuss this issue today. I'll introduce them in a moment. First, a couple of housekeeping points. This webinar is on the record, and in fact, there will be a recording made available shortly after we conclude. We'll have a discussion for about 30 minutes or so, and then we will open up for a Q&A. Now, there are two ways to ask a question. If you'd like to ask your question in person, then please raise your hand and wait to be called on, and we'll unmute you then to ask your question. If you'd rather submit your question in a written form, then you can press the Q&A button and type it in then, and we will do our best to choose as many as we can so we have a good discussion. So to our speakers, Catherine Belton is a journalist. She's worked for the Moscow Times, spent many years as a Moscow correspondent for the Financial Times, and now works for Reuters. She's also an author of a sensational book, Putin's People, out only very recently, but already receiving universal acclaim and glowing reviews everywhere. It really is a book for the ages. So my advice is to read Catherine Belton before you read John Bolton. Dr. Sam Greene is the director of the Russian Institute at King's College London and a reader there in Russian politics. He is also a writer, and his latest book, published last year with co-written with Greene Robertson, is Putin versus the People, also an indispensable text for our time. So we have an excellent panel for a good discussion this afternoon on this critical and timely issue. I'd like to begin our discussion by asking Sam, tell us a bit about how we got here. What is the origin of this national vote? What have been the steps that have introduced that? What purposes is it intended to serve for the Kremlin?
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you for the opportunity to be here, and thank you to everybody who has logged on. It's never a boring time to be thinking and talking about Russia, but it's a particularly interesting time to be doing it now. And I think that that's a really interesting question to ask in terms of how we got here, because it forces us to rethink a little bit how we think about Russia, right? So I think that we tend to think of Putin in this sort of puppet master role, pulling all the strings, and there are certain areas where he can do that. But when it comes to domestic politics and his own legitimacy and his own control over the system, it really is much more of a trial and error system than we tend to think. And I think that this is an indication of that, because where we are now, I think, is certainly not where we expected to be. So if you go back several months to when Putin first talked about constitutional reform, right? We all thought initially we understood where this was going, because he's coming up to the end of another constitutional term limit under the old rules, right, that would have restricted him to 2 consecutive terms. And that left open the question of what he was going to do next. Was he going to ride off into the sunset? Was he going to find a way to maybe switch back into a role that would be nominally subsidiary as he did in 2008? Or was he going to change the Constitution? And what he announced at the time, really about 6 months ago now, right, was that he was in fact going to quite radically change the Constitution. So rhetorically, we heard about redistribution of power away from the executive towards both the prime ministership and towards the parliament, and an increase in parliamentary oversight over the executive, generally speaking, creation of new centers of power and checks and balances within this system. And among the sort of Russia pundit class, right, there was increasing debate for a period of time, right, about what this meant in terms of Putin's own future. right? Whether it meant that he was in fact now going to leave Russian politics and hand power over to somebody else, or whether there was a somewhat more complicated game going on. My own interpretation at the time, and I think remains the same, was that this was an exercise in creating room for maneuver, right, in manufacturing different opportunities. That Putin, being strong, is still not institutionally strong. He doesn't have a command and control political system that allows him to get people to do exactly what he wants, particularly within the elite. He needs them focused on him, right, which means he has to keep them guessing about what his plans are for the future, right? So the Constitution was hemming him in. He was creating a situation in which he would no longer be hemmed in. But then we saw a process in which the constitutional reform started to take on all of these socioeconomic factors, promises essentially from the state to maintain minimum levels of social welfare. And we saw at the same time that a lot of this sort of checks and balances began to disappear. What we saw was a much greater concentration of power in the hands of the executive. And we saw immediately exactly what he told us we were not going to see, right? Which was an opportunity for him to stay on for a further 2 terms to 2036, if he so chooses, right? He may, of course, not choose to do so, but it's hard to see him not do that. Right? And so we saw a pivot away from what could be a much more flexible, but a much more risk-prone approach, right, to one that really reverted to the mean, right, reverted to type in terms of continuing the concentration of power in the executive, and not only in the executive, but in the hands of one particular person, right? And then, right, as we get closer to the vote, we find a pivot again away from that. So if you look at the rhetoric, if you look at the campaigning, it's about anything except what the crux of this is, right? So it's about social welfare. It's about stability, but it's not about Putin. Right? There doesn't seem to be any confidence anymore within the Kremlin and the presidential administration that they could in fact win this vote on the basis of Putin's own popularity and appeal. So we've seen this long and convoluted process of sort of trial and error as they've tried to figure out how they're going to maneuver themselves out of this corner that they have painted themselves into. What we see is a lot of divided opinion. What we see is not a lot of enthusiasm one way or another, and we see a rather odd and shambolic voting process, at least for the early voting, all of which again speaks to the fact that this was not implemented as designed.
That's very interesting. So the picture that emerges is one of ambiguity, in at least rhetorical ambiguity, in regard to the underlying intent or purposes of these changes. So initially, a way of maintaining options and flexibility, then hardening towards something that essentially meant the extension of the status quo, and then back towards ambiguity again. Do you think that's, in a sense, shadow play and something that masks an underlying sort of determination just to keep going on, or are there other reasons why this rhetoric around the significance of the constitutional vote has shifted in this way?
I think that there is a number of things going on, right? So I mean, I think initially there might have been some quite genuine support for this idea of changing the nature of power in Russia, right? Mm-hmm. But I think that clearly, as people began to push and pull in different directions, I think Putin probably and his advisors began to lose faith in their ability to control the outcomes of that uncertainty, right? And I think beyond that, public opinion reacts in unpredictable ways, right? They are not entirely masters of this space. And so they had to deal with people's continuing economic malaise. And then on top of that, of course, have to deal with the consequences of the pandemic. And so I think some of the things that they thought were going to work, including, what had been for a very long time, the very genuine high levels of popularity for Putin, right? No longer seem to inspire as much confidence in Putin's handlers and campaigners as they used to. And so you know, they're left to adapt the way any politician in any country has to.
Yeah, so much, as you said, much less control and kind of being a master chess player, so to speak, than perhaps he's given credit for sometimes in the West. So, and you mentioned COVID as well, so that's been an important factor. Turning to you, Catherine, so the circumstances in which this constitutional vote is actually taking place are different from those intended. The pandemic has complicated things. Can you say a bit more about that and perhaps about other sort of key aspects of the campaign, if we can call it that, at least the glide path towards the constitutional vote? Is that as Kremlin would wish?
Yes, thanks too for inviting me on. It's great to speak to you all and great to have this opportunity. I think Sam is very right. They have been sort of casting about quite wildly for how to manage this succession. It really is the great failing of the current system of power, is they don't know how to handle the succession. And it does look very much like they're trying to sort of buy time through this referendum to find a credible way. I think Sam was right. Initially, the constitutional changes did point to perhaps Putin removing himself from power. There was much discussion about whether he would become a leader of a state council, that he would sort of step back and become a father of the nation type figure, like Nazarbayev has done in neighboring Kazakhstan. But I think, yes, as Sam pointed out, as time went on, that began to present itself as too much of a risk. And indeed, we can see in Kazakhstan already some of these risks playing out. There in Kazakhstan, Nazarbayev is head of the Security Council, but already the new president seems to be taking steps to establish his own power. Nazarbayev's daughter, who is the second most powerful person in Kazakhstan's political kind of system, has just been ousted as Speaker of the Senate. So, you know, there are moves there afoot, and I think Putin has realized through past experiences that there are no guarantees when you're no longer president, when you no longer have control of all the reins of power. We've seen this with what happened where Dmitry Medvedev was president between 2008 and 2012. So yes, they have been casting about, and yes, you're right. The referendum is taking place under circumstances very far away from what they originally envisioned. Obviously, they were first going to hold it in April. It looked to be a dead cert for Putin then, but then of course the pandemic came, cast a pall over everything, as it has over countries across the world. Putin was forced to withdraw. He left the handling of the crisis to his government, to the regional leaders, and was seen to be very distant in the managing of the crisis. And indeed, even some regional leaders, such as the Moscow mayor, Sergei Sobyanin, were pointing out holes and actually defying the Kremlin line on whether it was a big problem or not, and speaking out and saying, actually, we have got a real infection problem. So of course they had to delay the vote. Initially, the talk was that it would be held in September. This to give sort of sufficient time for the virus to ebb away. But it seems that they've sort of seized the moment, even though Russia still has the third highest cases globally of COVID. They're taking kind of advantage of perhaps a decline in hospitalizations and an attempt to kind of use this moment to force kind of rush through the vote. But it also kind of gives them an opportunity to perhaps fudge the figures a little more than if they'd held it in September. Of course, if they'd waited till September, there would have been more time for the economic fallout to impact Putin's popularity even more. Already, his very distant handling of the crisis has pushed his ratings down to the lowest in his 20-year rule at 59% officially. The independent pollsters we're not sure about, they might be even lower. But so they've got a window now in which in which they can rush through the vote before the economic fallout leads to further unemployment, further bankruptcies of small and medium enterprises. They're catching the moment, but it's also a moment which means that they've sort of used the pandemic also as a kind of a fig leaf, which allows them to carry the vote out over a 7-day period. They can have more distant voting, i.e. electronic voting, which also means that independent observers aren't going to have much chance to oversee the vote. Social distancing and people wearing masks while they're voting mean that independent observers aren't really going to be able to verify the identities of people voting. Already we've seen instances of, well, one Moscow journalist has already said that he was able to vote twice, and rather than investigating that, the police came to investigate him. I think we've seen a lot of instances, have been multitudinous reports of workers being pressured into voting for the referendum, voting yes for the referendum, which, as Sam rightly pointed out, covers all these social, economic questions of indexing pensions, enshrining a minimum wage, and also has covered questions such as effectively making marriage a heterosexual institution, and sort of enshrining God into the constitution, which means that essentially most of the advertising for the referendum has actually been about sort of enshrining a system of traditional conservative values rather than voting to allow Putin to remain in power until 2036. It's almost as if they're embarrassed about that it almost has barely been mentioned in any of the coverage. But it's also created a system in which it's very difficult to vote no against them, because of course you want your pensions to be indexed, of course you want the wages to be hiked, and perhaps the appeal to traditional conservative values also chimes well with the majority still. So you can't sort of vote against lengthening Putin's term in power and yes for the rest of them. So it's also left the opposition with little room for maneuver, because it makes it difficult for them to sort of lead a protest against sort of hiking the minimum wage, for instance. So it has made things very difficult, and it's just created a lot of room for obfuscation. I think Alexei Navalny's position on this has shifted. He was initially calling for a protest which was meant to be held, I think this last weekend, but he soon faced a new criminal investigation over alleged libel, and he seems to have backed off that. He's now calling for a boycott, just saying it's meaningless because Putin doesn't follow the constitution anyway. But we have seen some interesting signs of opposition to it. We've seen Gennady Zyuganov, the communist leader, sort of breaking his tradition to sort of kowtowing to the Kremlin's will on almost everything. He's finally speaking out and saying that this would essentially confirm the rule of the oligarchic dictatorship, and he is calling for a no vote, but it's going to have very little impact, in which even the Electoral Commission chief has effectively ruled that any opposition to the referendum is not going to be given media space. So there is no oversight and no room for the opposition, so we will see exactly what the Kremlin wants us to see.
A very interesting picture there. On the one hand, as you say, all these administrative measures that the Kremlin has at its disposal to ensure the right result. On the other hand, de-emphasizing the most important change, that it would allow Putin to continue in office after 2024. And also your point about being concerned to rush this through sooner than most people expected or predicted, or perhaps from a public health point of view might be wise. So they still feel they need to do that. It's very interesting. So voting, I suppose, concludes rather than takes place on the 1st of July, because it's already been going on, as you mentioned, for a few days now. So what do you see as result and the larger outcome of this. So what, in rough numerical terms, can we predict numbers, both of turnout and of vote for? But then what follows from that? Does that deliver the Kremlin what it wants in a more or less unproblematic way, or are there still kind of questions, issues that remain unresolved?
I think we've already seen the result that the Kremlin wants, because they're already publishing exit polls by the state-run polling agency Belton. They're already saying that according to their exit polls, it's going to be a 76% vote for the referendum. Obviously, this is early days. I think they've only polled about, I think they said 16,000 people, or perhaps 160,000. I'm not really sure, but we will see these exit polls coming out probably from now on. And indeed, the Kremlin wants to see a kind of a hefty, healthy majority in favor, as this will indeed sort of allow Putin time to consider his options still. This has been a continuing headache for him. They don't know how to hand over power without risk. I think his inner circle had seen the consequences of even having a sort of a malleable figure like Dmitry Medvedev as president. They felt that they were getting sort of squashed out of the economy, or there was greater and greater risk of that. And also, of course, Medvedev's overtures to the US in allowing an abstention on the United Nations vote over Libya some years ago also caused great irritation. Yeah, I think we've they just need enough of kind of a majority to give them more time to try and figure things out. But Sam, I'm sure you have.
Sam, yeah. So what's the longer view on this, do you think?
Well, I mean, again, I think it's hard to know. We would have assumed, right? At least I would have assumed that what they would have wanted was something that would have shown that at least a majority of eligible voters, right, had supported this. That would have underscored the legitimacy of this exercise. We can't call it a referendum, right? It's a plebiscite or a national vote or something. But they're allergic to the term and the concept of a referendum. But so that would have meant that we would have needed something mathematically, in the range of 70% voting for it against 70% turnout, right? So that you would have had 50-something% overall. And that certainly seems to be where the initial data that they're showing us, right, are headed, right? But of course, those can be heavily manipulated. I think the problem that they run into is that it begins to become dangerous when you manipulate voting outcomes, more than a certain amount. You can kind of play around on the margins, but when people look around, right, and know that, nobody that they know or nobody in their neighborhood voted for the referendum, voted for the Constitution, then if they look at the news, they look at the official data and find out that in fact they're being told that they don't exist, right? That is offensive, right? It's angering, and that is the kind of thing that has led to protests in Russia before. Whether you think about last summer's protests around Moscow municipal elections, or whether you think about the protests in 2011, 2012, it's this message that we're not counting your opinions, we're not counting your votes, right? So they have to be a little bit careful in terms of how they project this and how they play it, right? They can't go too far in trying to get the numbers that they want if the census, in fact, those numbers are going to be far removed from what people believe is actually happening in society. But I would expect longer run for the Kremlin to continue to maintain this kind of ambiguity, right? So Putin will take this opportunity to stay in office till 2036, and he will put it in his back pocket. He will not all of a sudden start answering questions unequivocally about whether or not he's going to stay in office. He'll say, well, look, I've got 4 more years left to go on this term. We'll decide that later, right? Again, in order to keep everybody guessing, right? Basically, because I think that's the best choice they've got. As Catherine was saying, when people look back at 2008, they see that, that Medvedev in office, even though he wasn't really in power, began to create winners and losers in unpredictable ways. So if people think they know what he's going to do, right, they will begin to calculate whether they themselves are likely to win or to lose from that scenario. And they'll begin to mobilize either for or against the outcome that suits their interests. And that is the kind of a situation that Putin finds difficult to manage, particularly in a situation where he's not creating massive new sources of liquidity to keep people happy, whether in the general population or in the elite, right? And so, at the same time, we do see a gradual tightening of control over various things. So it's not just reinvigorating the power of the executive, extending that power into the judiciary in new ways. It's also some of the softer, if you want to put it that way, things that we're seeing in the media space. So the stories we've seen recently around Vladimir and other places, pressure on journalists, pressure on people online, social media. The verdict, even just the other day in the Srebrenikov case, in the cultural sphere, doesn't, thankfully, he's not going to jail, but it continues to send these messages that, look, we hold the strings, we hold the cards here, and so people need to think twice before they do things, before they say things, before they mobilize, before they act on the basis of their own, thoughts about what the future is going to look like. Right? So again, it keeps everybody off balance, keeps everybody focused on the Kremlin. I think Putin feels that that's how he has managed, thus far for 20 years, and probably how he's going to continue to manage in the foreseeable future.
So more carefully curated ambiguity, we can put it like that, from Putin himself. On the matter of the result can be manipulated and even falsified, but it has to avoid being incredible. Otherwise, that could provoke a reaction. And to your last point there, and let's sort of explore this briefly before we open up the Q&A. But your very interesting point about this further tightening up which is taking place. And this reminds us that the system as a whole is still in motion. It's not frozen. There are still dynamics at work. So maybe you could both say a little bit more about the direction of travel. Maybe Catherine first, and then back to Sam.
Yes, I think it's a very good point that Sam was making. I've been talking to some businessmen quite recently, and they're very worried about sort of a kind of a tightening, this tightening that's going on. They're worried, sort of, first of all, that the Kremlin can use the pandemic to perhaps clamp down further on travel. Already they're saying that the sort of, even if some of them have been trying to kind of avoid the curbs imposed on travel due to the pandemic by leaving Russia through Belarus. But one businessman told me that the border there is now guarded as if it's a border with a NATO country. It used to be that if there was an Interpol warrant out for you, it would take 3 days to get from Moscow to Belarus. But he says now the border is completely computerized and you've got no chance if anyone wants to detain you. He said another of his employees tried to leave Russia to Latvia, and he was warned that if he wanted to do so again, that he would have to have permission from the government to be leaving the country. And these are for people with passports for foreign countries or kind of UK residency and so on. So they're very worried that the pandemic will be used as an excuse to kind of tighten control of the borders. As this one businessman put it, he said they very much fear that things really are returning back to the USSR. He said the people in government now are much more kind of in favor of tighter state control. We'll see more nationalizations, because if there are bankruptcies in the economy, obviously small and medium businesses are going to be hit hardest by the pandemic because the government isn't really assisting them at all. They don't really care about the small and medium businesses. They're seen as collateral damage in all this. They're going to focus their attentions on the big strategic enterprises, and indeed sort of private companies are most likely to fall prey to the bigger state companies, which will just simply swallow them if they're facing financial trouble. This businessman also said he feared that there would be a sort of a hike in the tax take. I guess we've seen Putin respond to that already by increasing income tax for the wealthy by a mere 2% to 15%. But I guess, which again shows that perhaps he's a little bit frightened of rocking the boat, that he doesn't want to kind of shake up the business community too much, which again sort of shows you where his priorities lie, i.e. in holding on to power rather than sort of introducing anything radical. But I think also we'll see in this sort of tightening and using the pandemic as well as an excuse to kind of launch more greater technology, greater surveillance technology. We've seen sort of the QR codes being used to track people during the pandemic, and indeed some of them have been sort of exfiltrated through voting in the referendum as well, that sort of people have been having to sign up through web apps and so on, and automatically getting QR codes which can track them. This businessman has also spoken about how they're worried about the sort of the increasing use of facial recognition technology, that if you were to take part in a protest which would challenge the outcome of the referendum, then you're on video camera and you might be indicted or charged for taking part in an extremist event, and that's it. It's the end of your career and perhaps an end for opportunities to travel. So I think there's a lot of worry right now that it's sort of, we're heading into a kind of a Stalinist, very paranoid era of greater state control.
Fascinating, thank you. Sam, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think again, it's a balancing act, right? So from the Kremlin's perspective, they have the wherewithal to create all of this control. It would be very easy for them to not open the borders again, to increase the amount of surveillance, particularly in a situation like this. On the other hand, I think that there's an understanding that that can provoke a backlash, and that you can lose control very quickly in a backlash sort of scenario. And so I think that one of the things they do is to keep sending these messages that, like, it could get a whole lot worse, right? So behave yourselves. But at the same time, they look around, right? So they look and see, you know, what's happening in Poland. They look and see what happens in Hungary, and they see, wait a minute, maybe we need to, you know, worry about the courts a little more than we had been worrying about them before. So let's do something here. We need to think about the media over here. And so they are trying strategically to stay ahead of the game, right? This kind of long-term, durable semi-authoritarianism or hybrid authoritarianism that relies on elections, it does seem to work, right? But it's still a relatively new phenomenon, right? There aren't textbooks about how to make these things work for decades upon decades, and so they are looking around at other similar systems and regimes around the world to try to figure out how they need to manage this. They look very closely at Hungary. They look very closely at Hong Kong. They look at Turkey. They look at Israel. They look at all kinds of places to try to figure out, you know, where the next threat might come from and whether they can be prepared for it before it happens. It's a very nervous position to be in, but at the same time, they do have to, I think, try to resist at least some of this temptation, right? Because if you want to, if you turn off the internet tomorrow, if you close the borders permanently tomorrow, right, you will alienate at least as many people as you capture.
Fascinating. The language you're both using, alienating, or the concern about alienating, needing to maintain balances of some kind, and the larger maintaining of liberal ambiguity, to me all point to this limitations of power. Actually, there's a determination to repress and restrain and to use new technologies of surveillance to do that. But all the same, there doesn't seem to be an unwavering confidence on the part of power that can achieve what it wants. I find that ambiguity very, very interesting. So with that, let's open up the floor to questions. And again, there are two ways to do this. You can submit a written question by pressing that Q&A button there. And if you want to actually ask your question in person, then raise your hand. So I think we have quite a few already. So here's a couple of written questions that have come in. So one from here, in the very unlikely scenario that there's a change in power in the Kremlin, would a new Russian leader be more able to emerge from within the current establishment or from the embattled opposition movement? So would any alternative to Putin, in effect, come from within or below, I suppose, is a way of casting that question. So who would like to tackle that?
I might be the typical academic for a moment and question the premise of the question to a certain degree, because I think that the current opposition is not entirely outside the establishment, right? So as Catherine was saying, it's not hard to go to Russia and find business people, even some government officials, right, who are very unhappy with the way the country is governed, and yet they are, very well, embedded into that system of governance. So they are both critics and constituents of it at the same time. They would never, turn out for a Navalny rally, right? But they might not disagree with everything that he says. They just might disagree that actually anything would ever change. And a lot of what the opposition is frankly trying to do is not just to win over voters, right? But to win over some of these people as well, and to get them to realize that in fact this system does not have even their best interest at heart. At the same time, the idea that somebody like Navalny represents large swathes of the Russian population is also not entirely accurate, right? It's not exactly a grassroots movement. He does have genuine political support, and is a lot bigger than any opposition figure, at least from the kind of the liberal wing, has enjoyed really, well, certainly since the mid-90s. But it's still not the kind of constituency that's necessarily going to win him an election. And so if we assume that the next Russian power structure just comes about in a peaceful way, right, without some kind of a chaotic revolutionary moment, right, then it's going to have to be something that to a certain degree replicates what we have now, right? So Putin is able to play this dual role of being both trusted by the elite in order to manage their interests, to keep them rich and powerful, right? But also trusted by, for the moment, at least the majority of the population. And so anybody who comes to replace him, right, assuming that person is not a military, leader, not an outright, police state dictator, but who actually has to win an election, is going to have to do both of those things. They're going to have to keep the elite on board, and they're going to have to be able to win an election more or less convincingly. So it is likely actually to be somebody who's going to be able to bridge both of those camps, right? Somebody who's going to have some bona fides with the population at large, be able to appeal to opposition voters, but also not entirely alienate, to use that word again, the power elite.
Elites, indeed. Yes, Catherine. Anything?
It is indeed probably one of the most interesting questions is, yes, where does the next leader come from? And I agree with Sam. I think it's unlikely it's going to come from an outsider like Navalny, who has no experience in running anything. He's a great anti-corruption lawyer. He's a very charismatic speaker, but unless there is a very, very deep economic crisis, it's unlikely that he would draw enough crowds and protesters for a storming of the Kremlin. That's kind of the worst case scenario in many ways, because that would most likely involve bloodshed. More likely is that there would be some kind of rotation within the elite. As Sam noted, there are those within the business elite within the Kremlin who are very much embedded in the current system, who are not exactly always happy at the way things are going. There are sort of more so-called progressive views who complain, even within the sort of the foreign intelligence establishment, about sort of Putin's lack of economic vision. They complain that the sort of current policies are only directed at maintaining power rather than introducing any reforms which would allow the economy to grow. So I think there's a segment within the elite which perhaps would try to position itself to come into power, but how they do that, we already experienced this essentially when Medvedev was president. This sort of more progressive part of the Russian elite was able to come to power, but they faced a backlash from Putin's inner circle, from Sechin, from Timchenko, from Rotenberg, who all felt that their sort of economic interests could be impinged upon if Medvedev was allowed to stay in power for longer. And I guess the security hawks felt that the West had made too much of an outward show of cultivating Medvedev and as a counter to the more hawkish tendencies of Putin and Sechin and Patrushev. So I think it's this eternal conundrum of how you position yourself to be an alternative without offending or kind of opposing any semblance of a threat to the current ruling elite, who indeed are entrenching their power ever deeper.
The implication of that last point is that the successor is not something would necessarily think of, or not someone would necessarily think of, precisely because they're aware of the dangers of becoming too obvious a candidate. It makes the guessing game even harder. Your discussion of economics brings us nicely onto another question here about the impact of, over the next 3 to 4 years, of this double whammy of COVID and the systemically lower oil prices now, assuming they stay at these lower levels. What impact will that have on Russia and the strains or the dynamics or the tensions with which the Kremlin has to deal? So who would like to deal with that?
I'll answer quickly first. I mean, I guess we know already that the forecasts are for a recession of 6.6% of GDP this year. It could be worse, in fact, though there's been a slight improvement in the oil price since that forecast was first made. I think the greatest worry is on the impact right now on the small and medium businesses, because unlike in sort of European countries, the Russian government hasn't been prepared to sort of get package programs to furlough workers or help small and medium businesses in any way. They're preserving the rainy day funds, which are 165 billion and 500 billion overall in hard currency reserves. But this isn't enough at a time when the oil price hasn't been very stable to basically fund the entire economy. They know they're going to have to focus their efforts. So I think economists have been worried about sort of wave after wave of unemployment. I think Alexei Kudrin, the former finance minister, he's predicted that unemployment could reach 8 million by the end of the year. But in fact, I've seen reports with some trade union officials saying that essentially unemployment is already at 8 million. It's just not officially recorded because there are ways to sidestep this, whether it's through people working informally in the economy or just not being registered. I think we really have to see. I think the Kremlin has been able to buy some time because the oil prices rebounded from the terrible lows of a few months ago, which were really horrific for the Kremlin to see, because I think they were predicting that they would have to spend 27 billion alone just balancing the budget, which only balances at a $42 oil price, and then back then it was down at 20. So I think at the moment the oil price is around 40, so they just have enough to keep the budget going, but they are going to have to dip in to save enterprises. And I guess as well, that also depends on the scale of the global recession, because, I mean, obviously commodity prices, other commodity prices such as metals prices and so on are also likely to fall if the global economy remains in a downturn. So we're going to see this hitting the bigger kind of metals groups and other giants of the Russian economy. As I mentioned before, I think the sort of the state energy giants might start picking off rivals, because other perhaps privately owned oil companies like Lukoil could become targets because of falling revenues due to the oil price, and if they're not able to pay off their debts, companies like Rosneft might decide to swoop in and help them out by just ably taking them over. But I guess this is a game that's going to play out over quite a long time, because it's indeed the impact isn't going to be as extreme as we thought a few months ago, when oil prices really were very, very low.
But even more state in the economy, potentially.
Yes.
Sam, any thoughts about this?
I certainly agree with all of that. I mean, I think that on top of that, I mean, the state is going to be facing the need to make some decisions. It's going to need to make some decisions about whether it wants to prioritize the ability of these sort of core systemic enterprises and sectors to generate rents, right? Or whether it actually wants to invest in things that might create growth, particularly job growth, right? Their ability to maintain employment through crises, whether it's now or whether it's, in 2014, 15 with the ruble collapse, or whether it was 2008, 2009 before that, really has hinged on their ability to put pressure on these massive enterprises to maintain employment. That has worked more or less, right? But that is not really the problem now, particularly in a pandemic situation. And so we seem to see, a concentration of support and pressure at the same time being placed on these massive enterprises, and a little bit of handout. So again, if we go back to Putin's speech the other day ahead of the constitutional vote, he was talking about, he had this wonderful phrase about how the crux of economic growth and dynamism is the ability of the Russian state to support the livelihoods of individuals, right? Which is not a market economics approach to managing things, right? The state has really stuck to austerity for a very long time, and has had sound fiscal and macroeconomic management. But at the same time, I think most economists would agree that it has tremendously underinvested, right? It has the ability to borrow and leverage a lot more than it does. It's got a very sound position generally, but it has been unwilling to do so. Partly, I think, because they remain nervous about debt in terms of sovereignty, but also partly because I think they are unsure of their ability to actually manage complex economic interventions in an efficient way, right? So we go back again to this tax change that Putin talked about the other day, increasing the marginal tax rate for high incomes to 15%. It is such a timid step, right, that it reinforces, at least my sense, that they don't have the confidence to be able to administer a more progressive, a more complex, and a more pro-cyclical or counter-cyclical, pro-growth tax system. They don't simply believe that if they were to go to a much more normal graduated tax, for example, right, or targeted tax incentives in a more nuanced way, right, that they would actually be able to collect and manage those taxes. So at some point, they're going to have to start taking some of these risks, right, or they're going to have to resign themselves to a future in which it really is the state that both has to collect money through rents, right, and then redistribute it through direct support to individuals rather than through diversified economic growth.
To take more risks as times get harder. Klaus Whitman has raised his hand and would like to ask a question. Could we unmute Klaus, please? Klaus, the floor is yours.
Can I be heard now?
Yes.
You can now, yes.
Okay. Very good. Klaus Wittmann, Senior Fellow at the Aspen Institute, Berlin. I ask myself and you, where does this lead? If he stays until 2036, I'll be 90. Horror. And I'm particularly interested in Russia's foreign policy. So on my list of motives for Putin's policies, the so-called externalization of internal problems figures quite high. So if Putin's popularity decreases because of internal problems, and he remembers how it skyrocketed after the Crimea annexation, what may we have to expect in that field?
Right, excellent and alarming question, actually, given the potential implications. So, Sam, you'd like to kick us off with that?
Sure. I have a feeling this might be one area where Catherine and I might disagree, but we'll see. I mean, first of all, my own starting point is that you know, things start with domestic politics. So I don't believe that you know, at the heart of Putin's sense of his mission is a foreign policy. I think that he might have some ideas, but most of those connect to things that he wants to do at home, and it really comes down to, again, maintenance of an expansion of power. Right? You know, you mentioned Crimea, Klaus, and you know, I do think they went into Crimea for foreign policy reasons. I think they would have known, right, that it would not be unpopular among the Russian population, but I don't think that there's much indication that they knew exactly how popular it was going to be, and they were, by most accounts, I think, pretty surprised by how they were pleasantly surprised, right? But they were surprised by how popular it was and how long that sort of sugar high of popularity lasted. But Crimea was, in a lot of ways, a unicorn, right? So they didn't have to cross a border to invade; they were already there, right? They were facing a state that was, for a number of reasons, entirely unprepared to deal with this. They were facing an international community that was asleep at the wheel and was not paying attention, right? And they were able to do it in a way that was essentially bloodless, right? Not entirely, but pretty close. At the same time, right, it was a territory that, I mean, people in Russia, not Putin, right, but people in Russia had been talking about returning Crimea since the end of the Soviet Union, right? This was something that resonated with people in a way that I had difficulty identifying any other territory that would, right? You know, Eastern Estonia doesn't resonate that way. Northern Kazakhstan doesn't resonate that way. Belarus doesn't resonate that way. And with all of those other areas, right? Russia doesn't already have bases that they can simply open the gates, right? Russia doesn't have the opportunity to act against a state that is incapable of defending itself, momentarily at least. The international community is certainly paying attention to Russian troop movements in a way that it wasn't in the immediate run-up to Crimea. And I mean, frankly, the price that they have paid, right, the Russian economy has paid for Crimea and then for Donbass has been steep, right? While they're willing to continue paying that price, right, the idea that they would be willing to pay another price on top of that, to me, is a little far-fetched. And so while there might be some who would dream, right, about the opportunity to do something like that, I think the situation would have to become very catastrophic indeed before they decided it was worth the risk. And if things do get that catastrophic, right, then I think we're already in the territory of thinking about, you know, palace coups and other kinds of elite shifts that would decide that simply Putin is too expensive to have around. They need to shift, and then foreign policy can change very radically.
So it wasn't domestically inspired, and there's no other Crimea sort of waiting to be gobbled up, essentially. Catherine, feel free to agree or disagree.
Surprisingly, I agree, because I think, yes, they don't have the same sort of economic war chest. Indeed, the international community is watching much more closely, and we saw them sort of withdraw from kind of a direct invasion of East Ukraine. Of course, there was the hybrid warfare going on, but they didn't dare to move in more directly because they knew the consequences, and they knew that they didn't have enough support within the population of East Ukraine to sort of affect that type of move without really considerable bloodshed and huge international ramifications. So they kind of took the road of least resistance, as Sam very rightly pointed out. I think that, you know, the economic wherewithal that they'd have to sort of launch such a campaign is diminishing. Of course, it might be popular, but then again, it might not be if there's sort of more and more kind of body bags returning home, which they wouldn't be able to cover up as they did in East Ukraine by sort of saying it wasn't us, you know. So I think what we might have to watch, though, and what the Kremlin has been toying with, though, is Belarus, but that's not a military situation, that's a political situation. Of course, they've been trying to browbeat Lukashenko into a much closer union with Russia, and indeed this was one of the ways the Kremlin was initially toying with to sort of change the constitution and allow Putin to run for another term. There was going to be a much closer political union with Belarus, which would essentially mean Putin was presiding over a new state. But Lukashenko, of course, resisted. He basically called the West's attention to this, but now, of course, we see Russia continuing to try to put pressure on him by running opposition candidates in forthcoming elections. So I think Belarus is definitely the republic to watch, but I very much doubt that we're going to see any military action, just increased political meddling. So I think, yeah, I agree also with Sam that we would only see some kind of military intervention in a very worst case scenario. And yes, I think that would be, we would be more likely to see a palace coup before that happened. But on the other hand, I think the Kremlin's favorite game is indeed in ambiguity. And we've seen Putin make these sort of veiled references recently in the last few weeks to sort of protecting Russian lands and so on. He's made reference to Russian territory across the former Soviet Union that was given up at the Soviet collapse, and he can sort of toy with this national constituency, but they're very careful to not let it go beyond a certain line.
I'm glad you mentioned Belarus, because we will be having a webinar on that very subject in a couple of weeks ahead of the presidential election there on August the 9th, and things are really hotting up in that country. We've got time for just a few more questions now. A former colleague of mine, Duncan Allen, has raised his hand, so could we unmute Duncan, please?
Can you hear me?
We can hear you. Thanks, Duncan.
Thank you, Nigel. And special thanks to Sam and Catherine for your excellent presentations. I was particularly interested in the sections of your comments which looked at the what next question. In other words, what happens after the national vote has taken place? Because we're now not that far away from another quite important mark in Russia's political calendar, which is the series of regional governor elections in September. And I think there are about 18 gubernatorial elections scheduled. How do you think the national vote fits into the Kremlin's preparations for that particular exercise?
Yeah, so the next elections that follow, so what can we expect of those?
Predicting the future. Thanks for the easy question, Duncan. I mean, I think these are very different games, right? You know, Putin is not the force he used to be, right? But he still is genuinely popular and legitimate. United Russia is anything but, right? And we are seeing them struggle mightily in regional and municipal elections across the country, right? The Kremlin has now for a year and a half really failed to come up with a strategy that would revitalize them as a political mobilizing election winning force. Governors even if they are affiliated with United Russia, are running as far away from the party as possible, right? And the party and the presidential administration are having to work hard, in fact, to convince governors and find ways for governors to run on the party ticket and still win in their region. So this is another choice that the Kremlin is going to have to face. Do they privilege the party, or do they privilege being in power, right? If they go with the party for the regional elections, they will lose regions. If they really want to privilege staying in power, right, then they need to let politicians run on what works, and that means running away from the party, and then they run the risk of not having as much of a coordination mechanism as they used to, right? So they are going to have to find a way of doing it. I think that there might have been some hope, right, that particularly running the constitutional campaign on these socioeconomic issues, right, might have added a bit more juice to the United Russian machine, but that does not seem to be happening. If we're not seeing anything that looks like enthusiasm in this campaign, and that would be able to carry over, so it's going to be a very difficult environment for them. I think obviously they have multiple ways of winning elections, but it gets a little bit harder each time, and I would not see that changing this time around.
Catherine, would you like to add anything to that?
Probably not, because I sort of defer very much to Sam's expertise in that area. Obviously, yes, I think it's going to be very difficult for them, and obviously the deeper the economic fallout from the pandemic and the falling oil price was, the worse problems they're going to face. So, but indeed, I defer to Sam's answer on this.
Let's have one more question. We're technically over our time. We have so many questions that come in. We are allowed to nudge ourselves over our allotted time slightly. Here's an intriguing one, actually, from Tony van der Tocht at the Klingendale Institute. What is the role of the Russian Orthodox Church in all of this?
Catherine, I think that one's for you.
Thank you. I think the Kremlin at the moment is very much appealing to this sort of idea of Russian conservatism and traditional values as a way to sort of bolster their own power. They're using all the imagery of the Orthodox Church. And also combined with the military imagery in the new cathedral that they recently opened with the defense ministry and so on. So and obviously, and I think one kind of key kind of indicator of the way the Kremlin and Putin's people want to sort of establish their power is as the defenders of the Orthodox faith, as the defenders of conservatism against the neoliberal West. We saw this very clearly reflected in a recent article that was written by Nikolai Patrushev, the Secretary of the Security Council. There he was sort of again railing against the West, trying to destroy Russian values and saying that the referendum was a very important landmark in sort of protecting and establishing these values, the moral and spiritual values which essentially define us as a nation and as a people against this sort of decadent West, which is trying to sort of pick away at our spiritualism and destroy our values. So it's very much a defining feature for them, and I think they've very kind of successfully co-opted the Orthodox Church through most of Putin's presidency already. For part of my book research, I spoke to sort of one white Russian descendant who'd been working very closely with the Kremlin over quite some time during Putin's presidency, and he was essentially appealing to the kind of the old troika of values of Nicholas I, where you have sort of patriotism, orthodoxy, and love for the motherland, and patriotism, orthodoxy, and a sort of a strong kind of figure leading the state as basically the elements that you need to bind Russia together as a nation and as an empire. And it was quite funny, actually, though the white Russian banker essentially said, you know, it doesn't matter whether it's religion or whether it's communism, it's the cement that we need to bind the people together, and orthodoxy is seen very much as the ideology that sort of is the driver behind sort of Putin's ideas of statehood for the Russian nation.
Binding people in cement has a ring, actually, to develop that metaphor. But,
I'm afraid that's how some people would view the Russian economy's current activity as well.
Yeah, indeed. Fascinating. Alas, we have to leave it there. I apologize to all the questioners. There are many who haven't been able to get to. Very many interesting questions and observations, including actually how the West might or should respond to this, especially in the wake of Macron's very recent contact there. But we have to wrap it up now. My thanks to everyone who attended, everyone who asked some excellent questions, and above all, of course, to our two superb panelists, Catherine and Sam. Thank you very much. Stay tuned for future webinars of this kind, starting, or rather next, up Belarus in a couple of weeks. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on. Thank you.